Hello everyone and welcome to Big Rock Moto. Thank you so much for tuning in today. As adventure touring bikes are taking the world by storm, it is easy to forget sport touring bikes, which are still an excellent option for many riders who just don't care about going off-road. A few years ago, Suzuki introduced a bike called the GSX-S1000GT. That bike was based around the legendary K5 four-cylinder engine, and it had a sport touring riding position. Now, here we are in 2024, and Suzuki have introduced this bike here. This is the GSX-S1000GX Plus, and it's based on the same legendary K5 four-cylinder engine making 150 horsepower, but as compared to the GT, this has an upright riding position, much more advanced electronics, fully electronic dynamic adaptive suspension, and a lot more, as well as a higher price tag. Today, I'll tell you everything you need to know about the GX. We'll go out, ride the bike, we'll talk about the pros and cons, we'll talk about the competitors, and then we'll end with some final thoughts. All right, first let's cover the specs of the GSX S1000GX Plus. So for the GX Plus model, which is the only model we get here in the USA, it comes in at $18,499. The Plus means that it comes with the hard luggage and the center stand. In some countries, I think they sell this as a GX without the Plus, maybe for a little bit less money, but without those additional features, or you can get the Plus model. But here in the US, we're only getting the Plus. So the weight of this bike is around 511 pounds or 232 kilograms. Now that's without the panniers. The panniers add probably maybe 10 pounds each pannier, or about 4 to 5 kilograms each pannier. So add around 20 pounds or around 8 kilos if you add the panniers into that weight, just to factor that in. The seat height of this bike is 33.3 inches or 845 millimeters. The engine, you're using a 999cc inline four-cylinder engine, 150 horsepower, and 78 foot-pounds or 105 newton meters of torque. The transmission on this bike is a 6-speed. It has a slip assist clutch, which Suzuki calls some fancy acronym. That's going to be a theme in reviewing this bike. Suzuki has all these acronyms for all these systems, but it's basically just a slipper clutch. And you do get a bidirectional quick shifter, which works very, very well. The suspension on this bike is quite special. It is a Showa electronic semi-active dynamic suspension, front and back electronic suspension, and you have about 6 inches or about 150 millimeters of wheel travel, which is quite a bit more than, a typical road bike, which might have around 120, 130 millimeters or somewhere around that 4 inches. This is giving you that extra travel, and we'll get into why that matters here in a few minutes. Brakes on this bike, the brakes are going to be a subject of some sore point for me. We'll get to that, but the hardware is very good. You have Brembo monoblock front calipers on each side, 4 pistons. You have a single piston Nissan caliper there. Now, tires and wheels. So this is a road bike. This is not intended to go off-road. So what we're looking at is 17-inch in the front and 17-inch in the back. Your tire sizes are 120/70/17 in the front and 190/50/17 in the back. Fuel capacity on this bike is pretty generous. It's 5 gallons or 19 liters. The electronics on this bike are pretty extensive. You've got cruise control, which Suzuki calls smart cruise control, but don't be confused. It's not radar guided cruise or adaptive cruise. What it is that you can the cruise control will stay engaged even if you shift up and down using the quick shifter. So that's what they mean by smart cruise control if you're looking on the Suzuki website. You've got 8-level traction control, pretty advanced, and we'll talk about how that works. You have throttle or power modes, A, B, and C, and then a user mode. You have the electronic suspension systems, you have lift or wheelie control, and you have a whole bunch of other stuff, and we'll get into how all this works in the riding segments. All right, I just want to give a huge shout out to the sponsor of today's video, Intsa360. I've been using their new X4 for the past several months, and let me share just a few quick tips if you're thinking about incorporating a 360 camera like the X4 into your motorcycle footage. All right, so my first tip is experiment, experiment, experiment. I can't emphasize that enough. So what do I mean? Well, experiment with the mounting location, mounting angles, different perspectives you can get on your motorcycle by using different kinds of mounts. My second tip is that because these 360 cameras use fisheye lenses, they're really susceptible to showing things in the video if you have dust or dirt on the lenses. So especially true if you're going to use the lens guards, make sure to keep not only the lens clean, but the lens guard clean as well if you want to get the most out of your videos. The Insta360 X4 has become an incredibly important photographic tool for what I'm doing here on the channel, and I highly recommend you check them out in the links below. Thanks again to Insta360 for sponsoring today's video. All right, let's check out the seat height and riding position on the GX. So we have a 33.3 inch or 845 millimeter seat height, which is a little bit tall for a road bike because this is really not an off-road adventure bike. But, you know, it's within reason. So I am 5'10" or 178 centimeters tall. I'll show you how this works out for me. So getting on the bike here, I have a pretty comfortable reach to the ground, although it still is a tall motorcycle. Now, the riding position. So I want to talk about the legroom first. You see the bend in my knee here? It's tighter than 90 degrees. So this would be 90 degrees. You see how the foot peg is kind of further back and further up than you would have on a more traditional adventure motorcycle. So this is more towards that sport touring side. The legroom is good, but not great. And depending on what kind of bike you're used to, this could feel a little bit cramped, especially if you're a taller rider. Now the reach to the bars is very comfortable. This would be completely upright like Goldwing. This is the reach to the GX. It's really extremely reasonable and very comfortable in terms of the bar position. The bar is wide and tall. The only thing I notice is the seat does slope down a little bit, kind of pushing me forward into the tank just a little. And then this legroom after a couple hours, it's a little bit tight. If you're around that 6 foot or 180, 185 centimeter kind of range, 190 centimeter, then, this could be a little bit cramped for you. So I would highly suggest that you check one out at a showroom or your dealer to see if you're going to be able to live with this little bit tighter legroom. All right, let's quickly cover the features of the GX. So we have LED lighting front and back. Now we have these signature kind of small little rectangular LED lamps in the front for the headlight, and I'll take you for a ride at night and we'll show you why that's not my favorite headlight design. Just leave that there for now. The included saddlebags, okay, so you can see them here. They're easily removable. They're decent size. They're 26 liters per side. Now, is it going to fit your helmet? Maybe. If you have a small or a medium helmet, a street helmet, not like an adventure helmet with a peak, probably yes. But a larger helmets, unfortunately, probably not. It'd be nice to see those bags a little bit bigger, but they are very, very useful, and they come off and on the bike very, very fast, very easy. The windshield on the bike. So we'll talk about why I'm not in love with that later. The windshield is adjustable, but you have to use tools to do it. It's not something you can really do as you're riding along. The electronic suspension, let's talk a little bit more about this Showa electronic suspension. So Showa calls it EERA. Suzuki has their own name for it, which I can't even remember right now. They have all these crazy acronyms. You can look on their website if you want to get into all that. But here's basically what this is. So like I mentioned, we have pretty long travel, 160 millimeter or about 6 inches, which is pretty long for a road bike or sport touring bike. You have 4 preset damping levels here you control through the TFT. You have hard, medium, and soft, but you also have a custom setting. Now you can also go into the bike's computer and fine tune each of those levels plus or minus depending on what you like. The bike also has automatic rear preload adjustment. So as you add another passenger or luggage to the bike, or if you're a heavier rider, the bike has a sensor for that and it will automatically adjust your preload to keep the bike balanced out front to back. That's a very, very nice feature. You can also manually set the preload to one rider with luggage, and then 2 riders. And we'll talk about what I found with that preload here in a little bit. Now the suspension is dynamic, so just like on all the other premium bikes with dynamic electronic suspension, it has sensors in it, in the fork and the shock, that are sensing what's going on with the terrain, with the road in this case, and the load of the bike, and is adjusting hundreds or thousands of times a second, I guess, that's what they say, to meet those conditions with the damping levels. And it works very, very well. This bike also has something kind of interesting, which some other reviews have kind of missed. It has something called Suzuki Road Adaptive Stabilization, or SRAS, another acronym, thank you Suzuki. But what this does is, and I found it to work unbelievably well actually, is if you ride over really rough roads, even off-road, and I'll take the bike off-road here in a minute, the suspension does a remarkable job for a street bike of dealing with large impacts, rough terrain, rough roads. It has quite a remarkable way to deal with that, and it gives you a very controlled, smooth ride. Also, the range of adjustment from hard to soft is very, very wide. So you can have a very firm, sporty ride, or you can have a very soft, cushiony ride, and I really, really like that. Let's talk for a second about the TFT screen. It's a large, bright TFT screen. You have a lot of customization in there. It's easy to use. They've given you this four-way controller with OK and back. Pretty intuitive, really fast to use it. I love Suzuki's electronics. They work great. It also includes the connectivity via Suzuki's MySpin app, and you can do mapping and phone calls and things to the dash, and it works actually for an OEM system. Usually I don't like them. The Suzuki system is not too bad. It actually works decently. It's not as good as Android Auto or Apple CarPlay that you might have like in your car, but you know, we're getting there.
Right, 0 to, let's do 0, 80 to 0. Yeah, the brakes do feel soft. The lift control and the traction control is definitely keeping my front end down and cutting my power a little bit. But it's either that or do a wheelie. Alright, riding the GX, just cruising down the highway. You know, it's a pretty comfortable place to be. The windshield, even in a high position like this, it's still a lot more wind noise on my helmet than I would like, and I'm wearing a pretty quiet helmet and a Corsair or Contour X, sorry. At this speed, just under 60, just about 60 miles an hour, just under 100 kilometers an hour. You know, it's very comfortable. Of course, I could be going way faster than this, but I don't want to get a speeding ticket, and I'm also trying to film as I go here. The cruise control, one thing I will say about that is that the system turns off every time you restart the bike, which is annoying because to turn the system on, you have to use your right thumb, and to do that I kind of have to reach over here, and the throttle, sometimes I like grab the throttle weird, and I'm trying to turn the system back on. Then when I've got the system activated, now I can go ahead and set my speed here. So just a slight annoying thing. The mirrors are pretty good. They get a little buzzy at certain speeds, at higher RPMs, higher speeds. You can see it, you know, again, 55, 60 miles an hour. I'm only at 4,000 RPM, so pretty tall gearing. This bike can cruise very, very fast if you want to. For the suspension settings, I like to go in the soft suspension damping when I'm just cruising on the highway. It really loosens up the damping, makes it a nice soft ride. I'm usually leaving in drive mode B, and traction control, because it's so intrusive on this bike, I usually leave it in like 2 or 3. Sometimes I have to go down to 1 when I get into the sportier riding. Alright, let's get the GX through some corners here and kind of talk through a few things. The bike really does have good power, but you just really have to be willing to let that engine rev out. So let's talk about the traction control, the suspension, the handling, all that. So on the traction control, this bike is extremely sensitive to lean angle. So like if you open the throttle all the way and you have much lean angle on, the traction control is very intrusive about cutting your power. The way to get around that is to go in here as you're riding and say, okay, TC, I'm going to go down to, you have to close the throttle. You can turn it off while you're riding, which is nice. If you do that, now beware that now you don't have traction control. So you could crash more easily, but it does give you more power. I like to run it in like number 1 maybe. That seems to help quite a bit. I always leave the drive mode in B. I find that's fine. Gotta love 17-inch tires and wheels, man. This thing does handle. So I run the preload in 2 people. That gets that rear end up, makes the bike handle much better. If I put it in 1-person mode, the handling just doesn't feel right. I think that's kind of the theme of this bike. Like the brakes don't feel quite right, the handling doesn't feel quite right, but if you're willing to get things dialed in and kind of play with the electronics and play with the suspension, you can make things work, you know, pretty well. Now let's talk about the suspension. So if I go to hard damping, okay, you feel every little bump, every little crack in the asphalt, and it's a pretty rough ride. It is sporty and firm, like it's a nice firm suspension, and I think if you're an aggressive road rider riding on smoother roads or riding at a racetrack, you're going to really appreciate that. You can also fine-tune these settings if you go into the settings menu. If I go down to medium, you notice the change right away. You don't feel a lot of smaller bumps anymore. The suspension has a much more compliant feel to it. If I go all the way down to soft, it really softens it out. And I like to run that when I'm, you know, just cruising more, but when I'm riding a bit more aggressive, it feels a little floaty, so I like to run in kind of medium. So my settings seem to be TC1, suspension damping, medium, and 2 passengers on the preload. Then I start to feel pretty comfortable with the bike. I mean, it handles well, just like you would expect. Now, the brakes, we talked about it, they don't inspire a lot of confidence for me. They just feel really soft and mushy, in my opinion. And maybe it's just a pad compound that needs to be changed. Yeah, the mirrors get buzzy above 5,000 RPM. They really do. I don't notice that so much, you know, when I'm cruising on the highway, but then when you're starting to rev up the engine, you really do notice that. The more time I spend with this bike, the more I like it. I didn't really like it at first, to be honest. The more time I've spent with it, I've actually warmed up to it quite a bit, despite some of the complaints that I do have. I think it's one of those bikes that grows on you a little bit more with time. I think in general, part of the thing is I'm not in love with the 4-cylinder engines. I like triples and I like twins, I think more so than I like 4-cylinder. That's just a personal preference thing. I just find 4s to be a little bit peaky in the power and a little bit buzzy for my taste, but it's nothing against the GX. That's really just kind of a personal preference thing. Woo! Woo! Yeah, I don't love those brakes. You can really get some speed going on this thing. Woo! That's a fun set of corners right there. Woohoo! Yo! Some people have asked, can you take this bike off-road? Well, you can take any street bike on dirt roads as long as you keep your speed in check. Don't hit anything too fast or too hard. And be mindful of your ground clearance and the lack of traction from having a street tire. But yes, you can, so I'll show you. So I have to be mindful of any sand or anything. Actually, I put the suspension on soft damping. The suspension on the GX actually does surprisingly well. I would say of all the so-called sport touring bikes that I've taken on dirt roads, the suspension on a Suzuki is by far the best. It has some extra travel versus what you would get on a street bike. And it actually gives you a very, very nice ride. You just don't want to go through any like big rocks or anything weird like that, you know. But for stuff like this, where you just have some small bumps, yeah, it actually feels great. Just don't push it. I'm actually super impressed with the suspension, how it can cope with these ruts and kind of dips here in the in this dirt road. I'm actually really impressed with it. All right, riding the Suzuki GX here at nighttime. Let's go ahead and turn this bike on. Start it up. Now, I would have liked to have seen backlit switchgear on such an expensive motorcycle. That would have been nice, but we don't have that here. So let's go out, take a ride, and evaluate kind of the headlight performance on the Suzuki. Now, I really like the dashboard. It's just, man, this is one of the nicest motorcycle TFTs that I've ever used. I really can't say enough good things about that. Riding down the highway here at about 55 miles an hour. The lighting is just, it's just okay. It's not great. Let me try to turn on the high beam here. High beam does give you some throw out into the distance, but also not great. I would say just okay. I think when we get into the curves though is when we're going to see some limitations. It kind of has a really sharp cutoff to the light. Okay, getting on a curvy road here at night in the countryside without any steady lights to kind of distract you here. That's where, as I start to lean the bike over, that's where you kind of see a little bit the deficiencies of this kind of a light. It just has a really sharp cutoff. Now, if I turn on the high beam, you know, it's a lot better, and I can immediately start to ride faster. But you see the problem here, like when I'm in the corner, I just don't have very good lighting. Some high-end motorcycles have cornering lights, which can really help. This bike does not have that. There's low beam. Low beam, I really have to slow down for these corners. I just can't see. High beam, it helps, but it's still not great.
All right, so let's summarize the pros and cons as I see it to the Suzuki GX. So pros for me, the upright ergonomics. So when I tested the GT model a couple years ago, good bike, but I just wasn't in love with it. It just, the riding position was too sporty for me. And of course, this is subjective and personal, but I prefer a more upright riding position. I find that to just be more comfortable. This gives me that, and I really appreciate that. The handling of this bike, it's a sporty handling bike with these 17-inch front and back wheels. Once you figure out how to tune in your suspension and kind of get that rear preload up to get the bike to turn in better, you start to get used to the bike. It's not the fastest steering bike, but it handles well, and I over the time I've had it, I've come to really appreciate it. The suspension on this bike, so not only do we get extra travel, which really gives you a smooth ride, with all the electronic controls that Suzuki's put on here in combination working with Showa, it works really, really well. I'm not in love with the preset damping modes that they have, but because you have all that fine-tuning adjustability, I actually end up liking it quite a bit. So I do like the suspension on this bike, and I really do think electronic suspension is the way to go. The engine on this bike, it's legendarily reliable, it's powerful, you know, it's been around for a long time, it's a known quantity. So I like the horsepower of this engine. The technology on this bike, I like it because it's easy to use. You know, changing your settings on the TFT doesn't require a mechanical engineering degree, and it's intuitive, the screen is easy to navigate, so I appreciate how all that works. The quick shifter works very well, very, very smooth on this bike, and I like how you can use the quick shifter while you have cruise control engaged and not deactivate your cruise. The styling, you know, I actually kind of like how this bike looks. It's grown on me quite a bit, but that's obviously personal. And finally for me, a pro is that 150 horsepower, that's pretty exciting. That's a nice amount of horsepower to have. So what are the downsides to this bike as I see it? So the handling, you know, I said the handling was a pro, but it's also a con. If you just jump on this bike and you don't play with your suspension settings and preload, you might feel like this bike feels kind of slow turn-in and sluggish handling. So you just have to know how to get that suspension tuned in. It seems it's almost overly sensitive to the suspension setup and especially that preload. The power of the engine's power band is kind of a downside to me. So while the bike is exciting, once you get the engine spun up above 6,000 or 7,000 RPM, below that, it's a bit weak. And it just doesn't have the low and the mid-range punch that some of the competition has and that I would like to see. So now, another downside for me is the ride modes or the throttle modes, whatever you want to call them. So you've got A, B, and C. I found A mode to be just too on-off, like a light switch, too jerky. B is okay, and C is like really too soft. So I really only found one of those modes to really be very usable, but your mileage may vary. Another thing about the electronics, the traction control and the lift control and the lean sensitive like torque or traction control is quite intrusive. So when you have much lean angle on this bike, you feel like, gosh, where's the power? Like 150 horsepower, you're just not feeling it coming out of corners. You really have to dial down that traction control almost to the point where it's off, like either 1 or 2, probably setting 1 or even off to get the power you might expect out of it. So I just find that, okay, you're giving us 8 levels of traction control, make them usable, because right now levels 3 through 8 are pretty much all like what I would consider rain modes. I don't need 5 rain modes. I need like, give me a better spread of traction control levels that actually work. So that's one criticism I do have. The windshield, so we've talked about 2 things with it. It takes a lot of patience to adjust it. I mean, break out the tools and you've got these little rubber grommets that just are hard to move around. It took me like 20 minutes. I wanted to adjust the windshield before I went for a ride. It was very cold. It took me 20 minutes to do it. Like that's not okay. It's just not. Like this is a $19,000 bike. Give me a toolless windshield adjustment that I can do while I'm riding. Period, end of story. Like, sorry to be harsh, but I don't like that. Also, the windshield, it doesn't really have buffeting, but there is quite a bit of wind noise, but that could be solved with just getting a larger windshield. All right, another downside for me, and I've showed this in the footage, that the headlight performance is pretty poor. And I had the same criticism with the similar headlight setup on the V-Strom 800DE. I have the same criticism of this bike. I really think they should address that. There's no backlit switches. I mean, for almost $19,000, yeah, I think we should get backlit switch gear so when you're riding at night, you can see what all your controls do. The brakes, man, I talked about this in the riding segments. The brakes feel really soft and spongy. I don't know what it is. Maybe it's the master cylinder, maybe it's the rubber brake line. I don't know, because the hardware on the front is there, you can see it. That shouldn't be the problem. So maybe it's a pad compound, that could also be it. They just don't feel good. They don't feel what I expect on a premium sport touring bike. The buzziness of the engine, there is some buzz in the engine above 5,000 or 6,000 RPM, and on long highway journeys that can get annoying. It also vibrates the mirrors quite a bit. The mirrors vibrate quite a bit at those higher speeds because of the inherent vibration frequency of the 4-cylinder motor. The legroom, for me the legroom is a bit of a downside. Like on this style, I know they have to get those pegs kind of up there for cornering clearance. I get that, and that's reality, but in a perfect world, I would like to see more legroom, just because I feel like if you're buying this style of bike, this sort of crossover adventure bike for the road, you maybe want that all-day comfort, and I feel like it'd be better if you had more legroom. Also, there's a downside to me, like there's no adaptive cruise control. I know that maybe sound like a lot to ask, or I'm being picky, but let's face it, Yamaha has this on the Tracer 9 GT, which actually costs less than this bike, and that has adaptive cruise control, as well as all the other stuff like electronic suspension, a windshield you can adjust with one hand while you're riding. So anyway, I would have liked to have seen that. All right, so let's just talk in general about how this bike stacks up to its main competitors that you might be cross-shopping. I'm not going to throw spreadsheets and a bunch of figures at you because I find that most people don't care too much about that. Let me just give you the broad-based, broad strokes overview. So what about Suzuki's own GSX-S1000GT? I've reviewed that bike. I have a full review, which you can check out here on my channel. I'll try to link it somewhere here. The GT is a lot less money, but you lose the electronic cruise control, some of the fancier features. You have a much different riding position. That is a leaned over, you know, tilted forward, legs high riding position, where this is an upright adventure style riding position. That's going to be a key difference. They both have the same great motor, a lot of the same great things about it, but this is the techie advanced bike with that more upright riding position, with the electronic suspension, and you pay more to get all of that. Kawasaki now has the Versys 1100. They had the Versys 1000 LT SE, which I have a full review on here somewhere on the channel. Now they've upgraded that to the 1100. The Versys also has a 4-cylinder engine. It's also an upright crossover style bike like this. Has a lot of the same cool technology. Even has Showa electronic suspension. So you're thinking, pretty similar. Yes, the Versys actually costs more than this. That Versys is pushing 20 grand, if you can believe that. But you do get an adjustable windshield that's very easy to adjust, unlike this, but you're down in power. So this bike does have pretty good horsepower. The Kawasaki's 133 versus 150 on this, so that could make a difference to you. But check out that Versys. That is also a very, very nice motorcycle. All right, we have to talk about the BMW S1000XR. Man, that is a tough competitor for this bike. Everyone's gonna say, okay, the BMW is way more money. Well, not necessarily true. It can be. And now the base price of the BMW is about the same as the base price on the GX, but almost all the XRs out there are going to have the premium package, and once you add that, which gives you the features that you would expect to have, like the cruise control and all the stuff, which almost all of them have, then you're over $20,000 for that XR. Now, what do you get for that? Well, you get more premium features and technology. You get more horsepower, 170 horsepower, versus the lowly, slow 150 horsepower of this, and you're getting the BMW badge. Now, you have to look at cost of ownership too, maintenance and things like that, the resale value. BMW has a better warranty. I don't know, that BMW is a tough competitor. I think you should look really, really hard at the S1000XR. And you have to realize that even though if you pay more for a bike up front, your cost of ownership may not be higher. Assuming you own it for maybe 5 years, if your resale value is a little bit higher, even though you paid more for the bike initially, then did you really pay more to own it? So you have to think about that. Don't just look at the price tag, look at the overall cost of ownership, including depreciation. Yamaha's Tracer 9 GT, yeah, that's a tough competitor. Now, you've got a 3-cylinder engine on the Yamaha, very different character, very different power band. A lot less power though, 120 horsepower on the Yamaha, 150 horsepower here. So that's quite a big difference. Now, do you need that extra 30 horsepower? Well, that's up to you. The Yamaha, one thing I really like about, well, there's a lot I really like about the Yamaha. I'm trying to do a full review on that soon. You get adaptive cruise control, you get an adjustable windshield that you can adjust while you're riding. Really good stuff. They're also rolling out the optional automated transmission. What does Yamaha call it? The YAMT, I think. So that will be an option there on the Yamaha. You should definitely look at the Tracer as a competitor, especially if you like 3-cylinder engines like I do. All right, let's do some audience Q&A. I put out the option to ask questions on social media. So here we go. Someone asked about legroom for riders over 6 feet. I think that could be a challenge. I'd highly recommend having a good sit on this bike at a dealer or a test ride if you can get one, and compare it to other bikes, because the legroom on this style of bike is going to be a little bit more limited if you're used to more of a touring bike or even an adventure bike. So keep that in mind. The sportier position does put your feet a little bit higher and gives you a sharper bend in the knee. There was a few questions about why not get a V-Strom 1050 from Suzuki. Well, yeah, that's okay. So the V-Strom is more the rugged kind of semi-off-road option. 19-inch front wheel. You can get a V-Strom with spokes if you want. V-twin engine with the Suzuki's like 105 horsepower or so with the V-Strom with that 90-degree 1000cc V-twin engine, so that's much less power than this. But an L-twin has such a different power curve and sound and feel. So it really is personal preference. Also, the styling's a lot different. The riding position on the V-Strom is frankly more comfortable. But you don't get the advanced tech like the electronic suspension and some of the other stuff you get here on the GX. So you have to make that decision. The V-Strom's a pretty cool bike, but just off the top of my head, like I had way more fun riding this than the V-Strom 1050. What about compared to the GT model? So I think I covered that in the comparison section. The GT, you're gonna save money versus the GX, but it's a much more sporty riding position. You gotta be ready for that, and you lose a lot of the advanced features like the electronic suspension. Can it go off-road? Yes, actually it was surprisingly good off-road, just don't go crazy with it. But as I showed in my clip, I was really impressed with how the suspension was able to cope with that. Very impressed. Why doesn't it have a 19-inch front wheel? Some comments about that. Well, this is a road bike. You know, road bikes have smaller wheels. They're better for handling, for grip, for weight, for a lot of reasons. Only in the off-road bikes are we starting to see like the 19-inch and the 21-inch front wheels. The larger wheels are a consolation or like a compromise to give you better off-road performance, but they compromise the on-road handling. So a bike like this usually is going to have, and all of its competitors have, 17-inch front wheels. Final thoughts on Suzuki's GSX-S1000GX Plus. A big thank you to Suzuki for allowing me to have this bike for the past month and really put it through its paces. I really appreciate that. I'll be honest with you. When the first couple times I took this bike out riding, I didn't really love it. I was like, the handling doesn't feel right. It feels kind of sluggish to handle. My legroom was a little cramped. The windshield was kind of noisy. I was like, I don't know. And it cost $18,500. Then I started to spend more time with it. I took it out on some more rides. I started to like it a lot more. It's a bike that I think has a little bit of a learning curve to it, and it takes a little bit of time to warm up to it. But I could see owning something like this long term because number one, it's Suzuki, right? Extreme reliability. You don't have to worry about that. A legendary engine that's proven and stood the test of time already. A lot of horsepower, really cool features and technology, great suspension system, like fantastic. You could deal with some of the criticisms like the windshield and the seat. The brakes, you could probably even deal with that by putting on a better pad compound or doing something there. And the owners groups probably have a lot of this stuff figured out. So I think that as a reviewer, this bike is challenging. As a journalist, this bike is challenging because you jump on it, you're like, I don't know. The more time I spent with it, the more time I really started to warm up to it. And I really, really appreciate this motorcycle quite a bit. So I hope this review has been useful. Go check this bike out. It's a very, very cool, great motorcycle that should be on your shopping list if you're looking for this sort of adventure, crossover, sport touring kind of bike. So please support the channel. There's ways to do that down below. Thank you so much for watching. Ride safe. I'll see you out there.